sky's not blue. The sky's not blue.
More of you is what the world needs. More of you is what the world needs. You need to understand that when the time comes, I'm going to be taking over.
Welcome back to the Cult House Podcast. I'm your host, Roger Riddell. Joining me on this episode is 3TEETH frontman, Alexis Mincolla. How you doing, Lex?
I'm doing pretty good. Thanks for having me on the show. Also, that's Mincolla. It's Italian. It would be a sin to cut the vowel short in the Italian dialect. So.
You know, I'm from Kentucky originally, so we don't always talk so good.
I won't hold it against you.
I've been looking forward to this for a while. I had been thinking about launching a podcast for, a couple of years. And then after that conversation that we had for Revolver last year, afterwards, I just kept thinking, man, I could have carried that on for a while.
No, I remember. Yeah, we had a great conversation. There's, I like talking in general. I think conversation is sort of dying. I've had a theory about podcasts where I think that it's sort of like it's starting to fill a space where cooking shows we're filling, where cooking is so intrinsic to the human experience, like meat over flame or whatever. It's like it's in us as humans, but yet no one cooks anymore. So we love watching people cook. So we sort of crave that because it's missing from our lives. So now I think the same thing's happening with conversation, where human beings are social creatures. We need to converse, but I think it's sort of a dying art. So all we do is listen to podcasts now because we want to hear other people have conversations at least. So.
Yeah, I mean, for the last year, a lot of people just haven't been able to socialize like they otherwise would have anyways.
Totally. And not to say that conversation was at an all-time high before that. I think conversation is sort of dying, due to things like text and, people rarely pick up the phone and talk to anyone. We're sort of having these sort of super efficient sort of utilitarian micro dialogues just to keep going in our sort of high paced days. So yeah, I think that COVID was maybe a death blow to conversation that was already sort of I guess on the ground and bleeding. So.
Yeah, and the thing that really kind of sucks about everything shifting toward text messaging too, for me, has just always been that you can't really read
There's
nuance.
No
yeah.
There's no tone. Unless it's someone you know really well, and there's sort of an implied tone. But yeah, I mean, there's so much stuff that gets lost in text messages that it's the same thing with emails. Everything always comes across as snarky. It's really easy to be snarky in text and emails. Which I can't fucking stand. I feel like everyone's just kind of slightly meaner in emails for some reason. But yeah, I think that you can't beat good old fashioned in the room conversation.
Yeah, and I mean, when you add social media on top of that now, everyone thinks that they're a comedian, so everyone's just trying to be snarky all the time.
Which is funny too, because I think about how when you're dealing with things like social media, you can workshop your responses and is this funny? Should I write this? And this sort of real time sort of wittiness is really dying, because you meet people that are super funny online in person and they're not funny or witty at all and have no sense of timing, but online and behind a keyboard, people can be really fucking, hit you with those zingers. But that stuff is starting to kind of die as well in real time, which is why I think that when you hear people on podcasts that actually have that sort of gift for the gab, that people are like, whoa, this is crazy.
Yeah, and I've heard you talk about the wearing sunglasses a lot before, about how that kind of adds that layer of protection from people, which is interesting because I've heard Jack Nicholson kind of say the same thing before, where it's the eyes are the window to the soul, so this is armor for it
is. It's sort of my one. It's it's a boundary for me. It's a way to sort of retain a certain facet of my private life. Is you know, I like to engage my fans a lot and stuff like that. So for me, just to sort of have like, you know, that one little barrier, sort of preserve something slightly sacred to me, is just wearing glasses.
And you guys have been out in Joshua Tree for what, close to a year now?
Yeah, we have close to a year, starting in it was June of last year that we sort of achieved our escape velocity from Los Angeles and decided to kind of, you know, set up shop out there and really find a new environment to kind of inform our writing. You know, it was really kind of at the height of the lockdown in June of last year, where I think the anxiety was like really palpable in the city. It was like really, you know, it was like people like would occasionally like leave their apartment to do some push-ups like in the middle of the day, and like it felt like sort of like the prison yard of like when they let people out of their cells and stuff like that. It was really strange. So I was like, all right, I'm getting out of here. So we went to the desert and kind of never looked back. Like we really fell in love with it. Some of us have even like relocated out there full time and stuff like that. So yeah, the desert has been something that, it's weird. I didn't think I was going to like it as much as I did, and I just really fell in love with it. You know?
Yeah, so I also saw that you had contributed an afterword to a new edition of Sex, Drugs, and Magic by Robert Anton Wilson.
I did. That was a real big honor. Like that was something that I got really excited about, because I've been such a huge fan of Robert Anton Wilson's work, and it's like, you know, like life-changing sort of pieces of literature for me. Like Prometheus Rising was one that really just changed the way I thought in general. And you know, as a sort of thinker, and a sort of like humorist, I've just really always loved his work. And I was sort of provided the opportunity by a mutual friend, Grant Morrison. I mean, obviously Robert Anton Wilson's dead, but the people who I guess manage his estate, which is his daughter Christina, and another gentleman from Hilaritas Press named Rasa, who had reached out because Grant Morrison, the comic writer, is a friend of mine, and he had recommended that I also participate in it. So shout out to Grant for that. That was super cool of him. And, you know, they kind of gave it to me as like, hey, like, here's the book that we're going to do it on. And like, you can kind of write whatever you want. And I just sort of pitched them this sort of batshit idea of sort of trying to create a corollary between the alchemical primes of salt, sulfur, and mercury, and comparing it to Sex, Drugs, and Magic. And I don't know if you've read the thing yet, but it's pretty funny. I tried to take what a approach that Robert Anton Wilson would approve of, where it doesn't take itself too serious, but there's still a ton of fun information in there, while just making sure that all in all, it's just pretty funny. You know?
I haven't read that yet, but I did read the article that you recently wrote for Revolver.
Oh yeah, look at me! I've been writing so much lately. It's fun, which is something I really feel like after this record I'd like to explore more, because I've always enjoyed writing, and I just like, it's funny, I just haven't had the time because we tour so much. But now that we've sort of had this great pause, it's allowed me to sort of, you know, take my time working on a record, also take on these sort of side writing projects that have sort of been thrown into my lap. Where the Revolver thing as well, they had discussed with our publicist about doing a piece on our time out there, and we had all these amazing photos because we've been documenting so much of it, that they were like, cool, do you like want to write a little intro? And I was like, sure. And then like the little intro just continued to evolve, and I just sent it to them. They're like, we love this, we're just going to publish the whole thing. And I was like, cool. So I basically did someone's job over there without getting paid.
You know, the two photos in that piece that were basically like your decapitated head on the ground. I was looking through it and I was just like, oh, that's pretty good effects.
Yeah, no, it was that was super funny, because there's a band called New Year's Day, and Ash Costello is a friend of mine, and she had asked me to be in a music video of hers. I said sure, and she was like, we're gonna cut your head off, and we're gonna the girl Lainey, who did my President X mask, who also did like the Lil Nas X effect, she's super awesome, really talented. She was working on that, and I was like, oh shit, well, Lainey's working on it. And they were like, cool, we should decapitate your head. And because I already have a life cast made from when we did the President X mask, it was really easy for her to essentially like rebuild me as a head that they were going to cut off and have the sort of practical effect. And sort of the deal was, if you're in the video, you can keep your cut off head. So I was like, say no more. I'm in. I get to keep a cut off head of mine. And, we were sort of out in the desert getting super weird and, occasionally just, maybe on some mushrooms and just kicking around my own cut off head, which is a weird thing to do while you're hallucinating, but super fun.
And the desert's just kind of a weird, like, otherworldly place in general at times. How has that influenced the album that you're working on?
I think it's given us a sort of, aside from it just being completely different, like we did 3 records in LA and we were like, cool, we do not need to do another record in LA. And I think it really helped us take a step back, this idea of perspective of like looking at a painting and standing in the same position the whole time. You're only going to see the same stuff. So for us, really kind of finding a completely different room to look at the painting that we've been looking at. But this is like, from almost like space, another planet, if you will, to sort of look at this painting and sort of get new perspective and new ideas. And for us, it's I guess, giving us this sort of 35,000 feet down looking at stuff perspective, which has been really interesting because we've written some pretty heavy scathing social commentary into what we do. And, oftentimes pretty, it's weird. People consider it political. I consider it sort of apolitical. But for this, it's like we have really stepped away from that and kind of taken it's weird. I don't want to reveal too much and kind of dance around it. But a real otherworldly perspective, you know what I mean? Like off-world perspective. Like if you were on another planet looking back at Earth, how you would describe the things on Earth, So that's sort of the approach that we've taken on this record.
Yeah, I know you had written about how much more of the sky you can see at night without all the light pollution when you're out there in the desert.
Yeah,
it's
really amazing.
Yeah, it's always kind of amazed me that like people can look at like all of that and consider like the vastness of everything that's out there and still just kind of think that this is all that there is. There's nothing else out there. Yeah.
No, it's funny. There was a famous astrophysicist who once explained that if you went up to the ocean with an empty glass and you scooped water out of it and you were like, there's no fish in this glass. Now I will assume there's no fish in the water based on that logic. That's sort of like the same idea of us assuming that there's no life in the universe aside from us would be like, hey, we've looked and we didn't find anything. So, based on, how human beings are, the requirements for life, that there's probably no other life out there. It just seems so, I guess, egocentric and sort of pretty foolish. So I think that being out there and sort of, seeing the night sky in this sort of like, you feel like you're just on a glass marble hurling through space. Like you can see the Milky Way, you can see planets with the naked eye because there's just no night pollution out there. And, with that, it just sends the imagination to crazy places, which in a weird way, like you think about that's how the ancient humans saw the night sky. Because like, there wasn't cities with like a bunch of light pollutions. Like, the night sky was so much more vivid to them, which is why you have all these crazy fucking stories about stuff. You know what I mean? Like they were probably just, like, oh, that's clearly a god. Like everything was insane mythos to them, which, you can kind of you can understand when you see it yourself.
Yeah, and like all those cultures, it's kind of interesting that their mythos, all of their like collective mythologies kind of have these same archetypes running through them. And a lot of these ancient civilizations have these tales of like sky visitors. Totally.
Yeah, I mean, even the planets, which is like comes from the Greek word wanderers, have all been named after various gods, and this sort of archetypal sort of descriptions that we give them and what they mean and stuff like that. Like I just always find that stuff fascinating. And yeah, there's sort of like various like monomyth that is sort of runs a current through all these mythos that are in completely varied cultures, where it's like, how does that overlap with like things that happen like tens and thousands of miles away from each other? How do these myths remain sort of constant? Which it inspires a lot of fun questions, which is cool.
Yeah, no. Last time we talked, we had briefly like gotten into a little thing about the Anunnaki, and that's like it's kind of interesting to me, like where people initially hear about different things from, because I vaguely remember like the first time that I was introduced to the concept of the Anunnaki was as a kid, like fourth grade, mid 90s, watching Cartoon Network. And there's like a Johnny Quest episode at the time where it involved the Anasazi, which you can't call the Anasazi anymore because that's like a Navajo name for like ancient enemy to describe the Pueblos. And it's interesting that like that of all places would be where I as like a 10-year-old would first hear about like, the reptilian aliens or something.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I just find that stuff so fun. Anything that captures my imagination, I just really enjoy. And whether or not there's any merit of truth doesn't really make too much difference to me, because I look at it as just, it's fun. It can be inspiring. Like humans love stories, anything that captures our imagination, which is why human beings love conspiracies, because they are so much larger than us. Like, no one cares about like these sort of things that don't capture imagination. But when it's about like, Britney Spears, like being, processed through like MK Ultra, Anunnaki, fucking people are like, all right, I'm in. You know what I mean? Like, that's just fun. Not to say that I think people even believe so much of conspiracies. They like want to believe them. It's the same reason people love reading a fucking Zodiac in the back of a magazine, because, it's just anything larger than life. It just pulls us out of this like 9-to-5 bullshit existence. And I feel like, everyone's just dying to get out of for 2 seconds. Like it's a fun little escape, because like there's probably got to be more to life than, paying fucking bills and fucking taxes. So,
yeah, and I think your video froze up.
Oh shit. Is the audio still going or no?
Yeah, the audio is still going.
Maybe the video will catch up. Let's see. This is what they do. They make Skype kind of shitty, so you have to go to Zoom and pay the $10.
Yeah.
That's their scam.
Yeah, but on that same
still frozen?
Yeah, it's still frozen.
Did I get frozen in a cool position at least, or do I look like all crazy and weird?
Oh no, you're frozen like doing this. So you look like the thinker right now.
Perfect. So we'll just go with that. Like, damn, this dude's just like deep in thought.
Yeah, no, so on that same kind of conspiracy theory note, I was actually thinking recently about how like part of the appeal of that line of thinking too is just this idea of being in on some kind of like knowledge that other people don't have. Like it's kind of like when you're a teenager and you find the band that no one else has heard of yet.
Totally. Yeah, I think people. Well, I think that goes to like the autonomy of discovery. I think people like discovering things in general because it provides a sense of ownership. And I think that goes, like the band that no one's heard of. Certain people really, really enjoy that. The preservation of the autonomy of discovery is so rare in this sort of age of perpetual pandering. You know what I mean? Like there's like billboards and fucking, everywhere and digital ads and everything's just thrown in your face. So when you find something that hasn't been thrown in your face, I feel like there's a set of dopamine receptors that start firing. You're like, ooh, what is this? Why has this not been shown to me? And you find it yourself. That I feel like, there's something kind of weirdly special about that, whether it be, a bullshit conspiracy that just kind of feels interesting and fun, or a cool band that you've never heard of that no one else has heard of that you get to tell people about. So
yeah, I mean, I think part of that too like goes back to the thing that appeals to a lot of people about various religions too. Like, and it gets down to this thing where it ends up becoming kind of a purity culture, like especially in this country.
Yes, and no one can pass the purity test in this country.
Yeah, it's funny because like people get even. I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase this in that like people get so far into their beliefs that on like pretty much anything, that in some cases they are in them to the extent that it becomes hypocritical, and that they're basically mimicking the same kind of thing that they've mocked people who believe the opposite for doing.
Yeah, of course. I feel like, that's the sort of it's like a pendulum that swings of hypocrisy that eventually will get there on a long enough timeline. Like the thing that you started out sort of beating your drum against on a long enough timeline, you sort of become that thing, and you go, wait, how did I get here? And like, if you're lucky enough, you have that self-awareness. But for the most part, yeah, it's like, I think it's called circular spectrum theory, where essentially both sides of the spectrum are a circle, and they sort of join at far enough opposing ends, which is, I think you see a lot of that in our bipartisan politics. So yeah, the classic, unavoidable hypocrisy of the human experience is there, I suppose.
Yeah, and I mean, there's also kind of this whole thing that plays into this too, where it's the philosopher Marshall McLuhan had posited, like back in the day, that with too much information, basically, like people start searching for patterns and everything, and then that feeds back into that whole conspiracy theory thing being popular now.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that if we ever lived in a time period of too much information, it's certainly now. The level of infobesity, if you will, is at an all-time high. I think we are, just so inundated with information at this point that it's like people don't even know how to process any of it. So at that point, you're going to sort of end up in these sort of QAnon pitfalls.
Yeah, no, and I know that you're like a pretty big gun guy, but you're not like, I guess for lack of a better term, like, the stereotypical crazy gun guy in that respect.
No, I'm
Yeah.
there's people that support the Second Amendment who aren't like, jerking off to guns and ammo. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's certainly, I think, some very sensible gun owners in this country, and I think that, it's hard to sort of, it's weird. It's like, to support the Second Amendment, you don't have to be a violent, crazy person. You know what I mean? Like, it's totally acceptable to be a very sort of logical and reasonable person, and understanding why the Second Amendment is important in this country. And as a person that has 2 degrees in political science, I don't think it would be a good idea to disarm our population. And it's, I can understand why people say, oh my God, a school shooting happened, people don't need guns, we need to get rid of these guns. I can see why they say that, but if you actually do your homework and start reading data about it, you go, okay, wait, so like this doesn't change anything? Like, taking guns away from people, it's like the genie's out of the bottle. There's so many guns out there on the streets in this country. And for the most part, if you really sort of look at the data and statistics of gun violence in this country, 30% of it's suicide. Or wait,
Yeah.
I think 60% of it's suicide and 30% of it's violent, rather. And like 1% of that is like school shootings. Granted, 1% is too much. But, the idea that, taking guns away from good, honest people doesn't necessarily make dangerous people less dangerous. Like, there's something inherently wrong with this country. And I don't think that, like, you can pass there's no legislative cures for spiritual problems of a country. Do you know what I mean? And I think that this country has some serious problems. And I just don't think they're going to get solved by, preventing good law-abiding citizens from owning weapons. So, especially to defend themselves in a position of, a breakdown of law and order in this country, which could totally happen. Not to sound like some fucking doomer, but, when the grid went out in Texas for how long? Like, there's like I think people were surprised at that. You know what I mean? They're like, oh, wait, Texas has its own grid. There's like 3 grids in this country. And like, none of them are that stable. So there's that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting to me too, because like I'm from Kentucky originally, so like I'm familiar with people having guns and everything. I'm not like opposed to people having guns, but at the same time, it seems that like every attempt for people to even like meet in the middle and agree on like common sense kind of thing.
It's a battleground for political grandstanding. Do you know what I mean? Like, for one, there's so many gun people who are just single issue voters. They don't give a shit about anything, but they're going to vote, they're going to vote right because they're like, oh, well, the fucking Republicans don't want to take my guns. I'll be a Republican. Because that's kind of all they care about, probably especially in a place like Kentucky. They're not, like they have what's called the Knob Creek machine gun shoot in Kentucky. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that's like the mecca of gun culture, where for like 2 weeks, it's like just absolute insanity of people just shooting machine guns in Knob Creek, Kentucky, just blowing shit up, which it's definitely on the bucket list. I gotta go do that. Yeah, it's a political battleground where there's no real kind of common sense. Even the gun, like I live in California, which is probably the strictest gun control in the country. And I'm still a gun owner. Is there a lot of sort of common sense things like background checks? I'm totally okay with all that shit. Is there a lot of stuff that makes zero sense, that doesn't make guns any safer? Absolutely. Like the people passing gun legislation aren't people that know anything about guns. So it's unfortunate that you can't actually have real dialogue of people who understand guns, and then them passing legislation with people who want to pass legislation that's anti-gun, and sort of saying, hey, we could actually figure out how to create some common sense legislation that it makes sense. But that shit's never gonna happen.
Yeah, and it's there's like that whole mental health aspect to it too, where people can't really even agree to fix anything on that front. I mean, like,
and that's what I was saying. If you look at the statistics of gunshot kills, and people, it's like 60% of it's suicide. People aren't doing suicide with an AR-15. Taking AR-15s out of people's hands does not do anything. It's like the AR-15 is just the Honda Civic of weapons. There's just a lot of them. Do you know what I mean? Like, because it's reliable, it's fairly cheap, you can, customize it, it's modular, you can do a lot of things with it. But it's certainly no more deadly than a revolver. Do you know what I mean? Like, so the idea that we sort of like pick and choose certain guns to demonize because it allows people to sort of have these placations to their constituencies, be like, oh, don't worry, we'll take the AR-15 away from everyone, and they go, thank God we did that. That's not going to change anything. You know what I mean? I think that there needs to be sort of deep, sort of holistic change in this country if we're going to make people less violent. You know what I mean? There was that dude who drove that car into a bunch of people as of recently, and it's like, I think that there's always going to be people who want to do bad shit to people, and it's generally going to be based out of some sort of psychology of their feelings of feeling disenfranchised or withdrawn, or it's like, how do you create a society that engages people and doesn't leave them by the wayside? You know what I mean? Like, maybe we should start thinking that. Maybe we should figure out how to get people some health care before we decide to say, hey, no one can have guns. So I don't know. It's such a quagmire of a conversation that at the end of the day, like, I don't think will ever get solved in this country. I do think that, as being the Second Amendment, it's always going to be there. Like, I don't think they're pulling the Second Amendment out of the Constitution in this country. I just don't. So they need to figure out better ways to sort of get people to behave themselves without fucking just saying, hey, we're going to take it away. So I don't know. I don't know what the solution is for that, but I do know is I'm keeping my guns.
I mean, just on the mental health front, it's interesting how many barriers there are to getting people who feel disenfranchised or just other sorts of issues like that, just getting them help. I've heard in California, there's like a law that prevents people from, like, I guess, sort of forcing someone to get help. They have to do it on their own volition.
Again, yeah, there's a lot of people in California. It's a very big place. So I think that it's probably harder to run than most places, which is probably why it's such a fucking mess. So I don't know. I think that if there were simple answers to this stuff, it probably would have been answered already. But the reality is that, this country is sort of born of the gun too. Do you know what I mean? It's like there was like a shot in like Lexington, Massachusetts called the shot heard around the world, that like the Massachusetts Minutemen like kicked off the war that fought for our independence. And it's like, a country that is like it's so embedded in its DNA that like you'll probably never be able to change that. So again, I think that we need to kind of figure out, like you're saying, better ways to have solutions of having a better presence of mental health in this country could only serve us to improve our country. So I don't know what the solution for that is either. But,
Yeah. I mean, I think at some point it will probably also come down to reprioritizing the voices that are focused on the most in a lot of these debates, because it seems like in pretty much any debate now, they choose people who are at like the polar extremes of anything, but don't necessarily represent the majority of people who are probably
no, not at all. And that's one of the things that drive me crazy is like, it seems like there's an opportunity for a more data-driven democracy in this country, which, we have these representatives who tell you how people think and feel because they represent. We have this sort of representative democracy, and there's these elected officials that you go, wait, who elected these people? Like, this is insane. And like, they're serving these sort of incumbent sort of senatorial positions for like lifetimes. They're like, how is this guy still there? And seemingly no one likes them. Do you know what I mean? Like Ted Cruz is an example. Like, how is that guy a representative of a population in this country? Like, that guy is just like, it just seems like the most unlikable human being in the world. And that's who runs for these things, by the way. You know what I mean? Like, when I remember looking at they're like showing people during the senatorial races, and I was like, just seeing pictures of these people. I was like, who the fuck are these people? Like, I was like, I feel like it's harder to like build a career as like a musician than it is to like win a senatorial seat at this point. I just feel like no one wants to do it because it's such a fucking shitty position to have. But so it's like, you just have these dudes who are just like so fucking full of themselves. And, it just seems like, it seems very archaic. They're like, here we have, like Facebook has like 20,000 data points on every individual in this country. So why do we need representatives to sort of be like, here's how the country feels, and here's how the people in my district feel? We know technically how people feel. We have data points in everyone. Not that that's a good thing, but that's a reality. If this data gets sold for, sort of what we call surveillance capitalism, all the data points are just geared up to just sell shit to you, which is another sort of disgusting thing about this country. But like, if we figured out how the country actually felt, threw it in some fucking blockchain, had that sort of data points to provide us with sort of an understanding of like a roadmap of how the country felt, then we wouldn't be sitting here going, half of the country's red, half the country's blue. It can be more nuanced than that. You know what I mean? Like, I don't feel represented at all in this country. Here I am, where does the guy stand who wants to, shoot a gun off at his gay friend's wedding at a celebration? Like, that like barely exists. And you can't support, LGBT rights and be like, I mean, you can, but like, there's very few people. You know what I mean? You certainly can't in the bipartisan spectrum. It doesn't exist. You know what I mean? To be like, oh, I'm pro Second Amendment and pro social welfare and all those things. Like, it's a weird matrix that sort of might exist, but we're never going to know how many people feel that way, because we have representatives who are just being put in one box or another, which I feel like is really limiting. So, maybe at some point they'll, we'll have a more direct data-driven democracy. And I'm not saying that like the data should sort of make the decisions, but I think that the data could inform decisions that are made in terms of putting certain bills together that could benefit at least, the way people are feeling. So, that's a crazy idea. I don't know. I'm just a guy in a band. What do I know?
Yeah. No, that's the other thing that's interesting to me too, is just like who people like put the most stock in now as far as their opinions on everything. Like, it was interesting to me the other day that Joe Rogan, and like, whatever anyone's stance is on him, that anyone listens to him and like actually takes medical advice from him on like, that whole vaccination thing. It's just like bizarre to me that someone would look to like a comedian for that sort of answer to anything.
Well, I think that's sort of where we're at now, where like we live in this sort of like post-factual existence because there's so much information out there that we don't know where to get our information from. And we also realize that facts can be skewed and sort of spun with sort of, incentive driving various ideologies. So I think that we're sort of getting more into like dare I call it like more of like a poetic existence where we're like the person who talks the way I like the most is the person who you trust. You know what I mean? Like people invest a lot of trust in Joe Rogan, whether or not he is a medical professional or not, because, he's a person who they listen to and he's a gifted orator to the point where they say, hey, I'm now invested in this guy as a person that I can believe, as opposed to, a fucking virologist who might explain to you and say, hey, listen, you should get this because I'm a medical professional. But people go, well, I can't trust a medical professional anymore because he's in the pockets of this and that and this. And it's like that's just sort of where we're at as a country. And it's a fucking mess. You know what I mean? Like, it's a real mess. So maybe in the future, unfortunately, facts are already not mattering. So it's going to be like who presents the information the best. It's like objectivity will be dead and subjectivity will sort of take main stage in this sort of like gonzo level existence of trust, where it's just about sort of like how the person says it. You know what I mean? It's not about what they're saying, it's how they say it, which is pretty dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of fed even more by this whole kind of culture that's developed where people treat politicians more like celebrities than they do like employees that they've hired to represent them, which is technically what democracy is supposed to be.
I mean, that's the sort of this concept of infotainment where it's like, you've seen, and I think the media is completely responsible for this. It's like, them just trying to maintain their fucking 30-minute news cycle where it's like everything is just bombarded with you for ratings. You know what I mean? So it's like everything has to be presented in this sort of infotainment format where it's essentially like America is now just a reality show on its sort of final season. And I think Donald Trump I don't think he was the person who brought in infotainment by any means. Because, I mean, I think it was Frank Zappa who said that the executive branch is nothing more than the entertainment division of the military-industrial complex. It's existed for quite some time. I mean, Ronald Reagan, for example, was an actor. Do you know what I mean? I think that one of the biggest sort of, Obama was huge into infotainment. He would be on SNL. He was like the super cool fucking, you'd see him on like Zach Galifianakis Between Two Ferns. And they became these sort of, kind of fun sort of, celebrities. And I think that I don't think that's good. I think politics should be kind of boring. I don't think it should be super, super neat. You know what I mean? I don't think it should be the sort of ubiquitous form of entertainment. Like everything is political now. Everything is entertainment, and the crossover between those two things in this Venn diagram is like absolutely ginormous now. And I think it's too much. I think that we need to make politics boring again.
Yeah. I remember, and I forget who exactly it was that said it, but there's like a quote that the only thing that you ultimately owe your elected officials is like the absence of your anger to vote them out of office.
Totally, I like that. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I feel like this country is more divided now than it's ever been, and I think it's like, I think the media is largely responsible for that on both sides, and I think that I tweeted today. I was like, sign up for political newsletters on both the right and the left to just watch how politics are just completely destroying this country. Because like no matter what happens in current events, both things will send a text to you about how they're politicizing it, and you'll get them almost simultaneously, and you just read both of them, and you're like, what the fuck? Like it's wild. Like it's a total trip. And I think we just need to pull back from that. Like I feel like it's like the idea that we still live in this sort of like binary bipartisanship is just insane to me. Like it's so antiquated. It's so old. It's so just like reductive to like the nuance of the human experience. So, hopefully we'll be able to transcend that at some point, but maybe not.
Yeah, the infotainment thing just kind of reaches this absurd level nowadays too, where when election comes around, CNN's presentation and I think pretty much all the other cable news networks presentations now are basically set up like it's Sports Center. and you're just like watching the scores on both sides.
Yeah, I'm like waiting for like the robot fucking motion graphic to come out and like fucking, fucking put another politician into the boards, and you're like, yeah, like that's sort of where it feels at this point. Just the way they use their sort of semiotic codes of symbols and sort of the way their stages are set up, and like, the way the people are sort of reporting the news. When, I remember like even during like the Bush administration when like, like the war on terror was the real height of that shit for me, where it was just like the graphics of terrorism was just insane. It was like terror. I remember I started like cutting individual pieces out of those, and I would use them as show graphics, and it would just like a compiled like version of like all the sort of fear tactic, fear mongering, terrorism news graphics that we're using, and I put them all back to back, and then I intercut the RNC of that year's speeches of how many times everyone said terrorism. So it was just that with like Rudy Giuliani and George Bush and all these people just being like terrorism. And we used to play it in a sort of like interstitial content at one of our shows, and people were just like, what the fuck? So yeah, clearly it's entertaining. We're using it in our shows.
Yeah, my favorite, I guess, sort of nadir of absurdity in all of this in the last few years has been, do you remember when the Malaysia flight disappeared?
Yes, I do.
There was like a whole 30 or 40 minutes on CNN of Don Lemon talking to people about whether it could be aliens or the rapture.
I know. It's like, it's fucking wild. And again, it's like, and this is why people are like trusting Joe Rogan now, because the theater of the absurd has become so absurd. You know what I mean? It's like at this point, like, fact has become stranger than fiction. So at least they like, hear a guy who does makes probably a lot of sense. I don't know. I don't listen to Joe Rogan. But I'm guessing he's probably more logical than most of the sort of talking heads out there, which is why people like him, because he does seem to be a bit of a truth seeker from what I know. But, just because a guy reads a couple of cool books and then decides to sort of, talk to fucking kids who like MMA and explain books to them because they don't read them themselves, doesn't make the guy an authority on anything. Do you know what I mean? Like, maybe they should go read the book themselves and develop their own opinions, but this is sort of where we're at. You know what I mean? People think Joe Rogan's a very smart guy, so they trust him. And, when they watch sort of like, I remember like people like Glenn Beck or like all these other guys on like the news who like would just be like complete sort of like theater of the absurd, political theater. It's like you watch that stuff and it's like more sensationalized than something like Joe Rogan. So it's hard to trust any of those news outlets. Do you know what I mean? And at this point, you'd sort of go, well, I don't know, maybe this guy has it right. So I can understand why, some like misguided bro trusts Joe Rogan maybe more than whoever the fuck is on whatever news channel at this point. I don't watch cable news, so I don't know.
Yeah, and just to take a few steps back, you mentioned earlier that you have sort of a friendship with Grant Morrison. So I was kind of wondering how that came about.
We were playing in Glasgow a very long time ago, and Grant and his wife, Kristen, came to our show. And we just hung out afterwards and got super drunk, and then, became really good friends. And they actually have a place in LA, and I would go and hang out over there quite a bit. And we just sort of became really good friends. And, there's always like, they have these like parties at their place in LA, and it's always just like the strangest cast of characters. Like, I can't even explain. It just feels like if you were to like have walked into like, like Xavier's School for the Gifted of like mutants, do you know what I mean? And like that's what the party feels like. We're like, no one has anything to do with anyone there. Like, we're all just from complete different walks of existence. It's like Grant just pulling together comic book characters and like throwing them in a room, and like then just like pouring tons of booze all over it, which is sort of a classic night at the Morrison's house. And yeah, I mean, Grant's just the fucking man. I love that dude. His wife Kristen is really, really close friend of mine as well. And we, just became good friends as sort of strange coyotes, if you will. But yeah, Grant's the fucking best. I love that dude.
Yeah, I've always kind of appreciated how he can take just like a really sort of simple narrative line and make it also extremely complex at the same time.
Yes. Yeah, he like sort of he creates universes within universes, and it's like I kind of talked about that sort of thing in my recent article that I did write for Revolver, where it's like if you stare at any spot in the desert for long enough, it'll start moving, and it might just be the tiniest little thing, but you're like, whoa, and then you start like looking deeper, and you're like, whoa, there's like a whole little universe right there inside that. You know what I mean? Like all these weird little bugs doing another thing. So it's like I feel like Grant does that with his writing. It's like you're just like this basic thing that if you were to look at it at a sort of surface glance, it's just that. But if you start to look deeper, there's all sorts of shit moving under it. And he sort of encapsulates a lot of that sort of like universes within universes within universes, which I really like that sort of kind of quantum thinking. That's stuff that I think always excites me, and especially in terms of storytelling. So Grant is the king of that, you know?
Yeah, and he's also kind of got that rivalry, I guess, for lack of a better term, with Alan Moore.
Yes,
where,
I've talked to him about that before. Which I won't say anything about on this because that's none of my business. You know?
Yeah,
I think they're both great writers. I think they're awesome. You know.
Yeah, I like to imagine both of them just kind of coming across each other in a public place, and they just sort of start doing that Doctor Strange like magic spell casting thing with their hands at each other.
I was imagining them both pulling out wands and having like a fucking necklace fight, you know. But yes, they're sort of a similar ilk of character, I imagine, which is probably why they're like, you know, there's not room for two suns in the sky. Do you know what I mean? Like they're just sort of like, all right, my space. So.
Yeah, no, their sensibilities are definitely very similar, just from a storytelling perspective, and I don't know necessarily from a personality perspective, because I think Alan Moore is much more of a hermit.
I think he's way more bitter.
Yeah,
like, he seems like, just from like watching him talk about his stuff that's been developed into film, and I'll be like, oh, I really like that, and he'll be like, this was the biggest fucking tragedy ever, and you're like, all right, I like the movie, you know what I mean? Like, and he's just like, it's a miserable piece of shite, and you're like, okay, well, I thought it was a cool adaptation, you know.
Yeah, I've been trying to work up the, I guess, right mindset to read his novel Jerusalem for like the last 2 or 3 years. And every time that I look at it, I'm just like, this is like 3,000 pages. I don't know.
It's not a casual read for sure. You know? Definitely not. You know?
Yeah, well, we've been at it for a while now, so I think I'm gonna let you go because I don't want to take up too much of your time today.
No worries, man. It's always a pleasure talking with you. If you ever want to do it again, just give me a shout. I'm full of hot air. I can talk. You know. But yeah, good luck with the podcast.
Appreciate you taking your time, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Good luck with the podcast, and let me know when it's up.
All right, thanks.
All right, brother. Take care.